everyone. In this review video, we are going to talk about several of the themes and ideas that we address that will allow us to dive deep into the topic of income and wealth inequality. So today we were focused a lot on corporate consolidation and thinking about the impact of corporate consolidation on consumers and the impact on people that are actually working in the workforce, ordinary Americans. So we watched that John Oliver clip that was kind of funny related to corporate consolidation. We also saw AOC kind of demonstrate her economics knowledge when she talked about the monopsony and monopoly model in a House oversight hearing meeting. So the first model that we've developed, which is at the extreme of output markets, it's the imperfectly competitive extreme, is the monopoly model, where there's only one seller of a good or service. And so remember I said, we study extremes in economics so we can understand the range of possibility that exists between extremes. And sort of the argument that AOC presented and John Oliver presented is that there's been this trend towards increasing corporate consolidation. So essentially markets are becoming dominated by an even smaller and smaller number of firms in an industry. And the more consolidated markets become, the more those markets themselves start to behave like monopolies. And so the monopoly model, although it's an extreme, can still allow us to sort of gain insight into how these markets actually operate in reality, these consolidated markets. And so here we can see, which I've said a million times, we see a downward sloping demand curve reflecting the idea that the monopolist owns, or it has the monopolist, the demand curve reflects the monopolist owns the entire market essentially. And then we see a marginal revenue curve that falls at a faster rate than the demand curve. The reason why this happens is because of something called the poisoning effect. So if you assume that the monopolist can only charge one price, to expand output, you have to lower the price. And this leads to a marginal revenue curve that is falling at a faster rate than the demand curve. Then we see here an average total cost curve that is initially downward sloping and then becomes upward sloping. And then the marginal cost curve intersecting the ATC curve at its minimum point right here. The profit maximizing rule, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We're going to find that intersection and then we can tell a story with the graph. So at this intersection, we go down to the x-axis and we find Q star. Then we go up to the demand curve and across and we find P star. So P star reflects the price that the monopolist will charge and Q star reflects the quantity of output that the monopolists will sell. Now what's interesting is we can see the effects on social welfare using consumer, producer, surplus, etc. So we notice in this red triangle right here, we get deadweight loss because this is actually a market failure. And a market failure is a situation in which leaving the market alone does not maximize social welfare. And we said if we assume the other extreme of perfect competition, that you're always going to end up in a situation at the allocatively efficient price and quantity that maximizes social welfare, which is the sum of producer and consumer surplus. And we can actually see graphically and put in contrast to the price that the monopolist will charge, we can see graphically the price that that a perfectly competitive market would charge. And we can see that it's lower at PPC, which I labeled here, at the allocatively efficient price and quantity, this intersection right here, where the marginal cost curve crosses the demand curve. This reflects the price that would be charged in a perfectly competitive market. We can see it's lower than the price the monopolist charges. We can also see that the output in a perfectly competitive market would be greater than the output in a monopoly market. And we would also be able to see that there would be no deadweight loss in this market and social welfare would be maximized. So in all market failures, where leaving the market alone doesn't produce the socially maximizing welfare, you can actually remedy this with government intervention. So if you actually install the price ceiling at the perfectly competitive price level, you would force the monopolist to expand its output and all this deadweight loss would go away. So government intervention can do a lot of good. Now let's more simply kind of see the story this tells. This says that a monopolist can charge a markup, a price greater than the cost to produce, by virtue of it having market power, by virtue of it being a monopolist and not having constraints imposed on it by other firms that are competing with it. We also know that a monopolist produces less output than perfectly competitive markets do, or more competitive markets do. And so we can see how monopolies can be problematic. We also used a little bit of game theory to think about the behavior of firms in between the market extreme of perfectly competitive and monopoly. And we kind of use a bit of game theory, a simple 2x2 payoff matrix to understand the behavior of oligopolies. And we said, even if there's players like very, very concentrated markets, there might be still some incentive for oligopolies or firms and oligopolies to deviate and to potentially price undercut other players in the market. So we need game theory to think about sort of the incentives that exist in these types of markets. But oligopolies can form cartels, even though that's illegal in the United States, or try to cooperate with one another so they can behave more like a monopoly. So the more cooperation that exists within an oligopoly, an oligopolistic market, the more it behaves like a monopoly, is able to charge a price greater than the cost to produce, called a markup, and output would be depressed. On the flip side of this story about corporate consolidation that AOC also mentioned, is that if firms are becoming more and more consolidated, markets are becoming more and more consolidated, they can behave when they actually enter factor markets or input markets and are trying to buy labor, they can behave more and more like monopsonists. And remember, a monopsony is kind of the reverse of a monopoly. That means there's one buyer instead of one seller. And in this case, we're buying labor. So here we can see the supply curve reflects workers, the demand curve we can see here, which reflects the marginal revenue product of labor, which we said is just a function of price times the marginal product of labor, or the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. I don't want you to get intimidated by this. All this reflects is this idea that a worker's value is a function of the price of the good that they're producing and their additional product that they bring to the firm by being hired by the firm. That's all this reflects. Remember, we used the potato chip example. What's a more valuable worker? Someone that makes potato chips or someone that makes computer chips? You said computer chips. They're also additional product that they bring to the firm is also goes into consideration when a firm considers hiring workers. So we have a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, and we can see that the marginal cost curve, similar to the way that the marginal revenue curve is disjointed for the demand curve in the monopoly model, but in this case, the marginal factor cost curve rises at a faster rate than the supply curve. And the logic behind this is simple, that a monopsonist, if they wanted to acquire more and more workers, they don't get to just raise the wage on the marginal worker, they have to raise the wage on all the previous workers as well, because then the other workers would be upset, so their marginal factor cost rises at a faster rate than the supply curve. Then the profit maximizing rule, we go at the intersection of the marginal factor costs and the marginal revenue curve, or the demand curve. We can go across and we can see actually the WU, which is the actual worth of a worker in this monopsony model. We go down to the supply curve and across and we arrive at W star, which is the wage that the workers in this model would actually receive. So we can see that workers are not paid what they're worth. And we can actually go further down and we can see that Q star reflects the actual quantity supplied of workers in this model. We can see a shortage exists because there's a gap between the wage rate, the quantity demanded at the wage rate, and the quantity supplied at that wage rate, because it's a pretty low wage. Then we can see respectively producer surplus and consumer surplus. Remember, consumer surplus reflects the surplus that firms get, and producer surplus in this example reflects the surplus that workers get. Again, government intervention can solve this. So actually, if we install a minimum wage at what would be the perfectly competitive, so this would be a minimum wage, we would actually expand output, assuming we were in a monopsony model, we'd actually expand output and higher the wage of the workers, which is kind of a counterintuitive result, but this is one way in markets that are very heavily consolidated, monopsonistic almost, you can actually increase the minimum wage and expand output. We're done.